my name is Kim Suyeon, a MA student of English Literature at Yonsei University. Today, I'd like to walk you through the prostitution in the Victorian age by closely analyzing the dichotomized ideology on femininity and the CD Acts, which stands for the Contagious Disease Act. I prepared this presentation because the attempt to dichotomize men and women and to distinguish good women from bad women still persists today, as does the systematic pathologization of women and demonizing sexuality, especially the female sexuality. In this context, this overview of prostitution and the government control of prostitutes allows us to understand the current taboo and gendered ideology against prostitution in the contemporary society. My content is as follows. First, I will talk about prostitutes and the prostitution as a social constituent rather than a shameful profession of a few fallen women so that we can understand who they were and how they lived. Second, I will talk about the Contagious Disease Act that date from 1864 to 1886, which was a topic of a heated debate regarding the social understanding of prostitution and how they affected women in the profession's lives. And lastly, I will briefly explain how feminists reacted to the CD Acts. I did not add in discussions about other sexualities or pedophile prostitution besides the heterosexual interactions and relationships between women and men. And here, by other sexualities, I mean such as homosexuality, or lesbianism, or sexual experiments of a few individuals, to focus on how prostitution was an integral part of society, not only in its necessity in maintaining the middle-class nuclear families, but also as a socially construct class of women. So this is the first part, and first I will give an overview of prostitution as an institution rather than the great social evil as the Victorians argued. Understanding of who the prostitutes were and what the prostitution was were differed from our understanding. Here are some definitions of who the prostitutes were by their contemporaries given in 1840s. For instance, William Tate and Ralph Wardlow distinguished prostitutes from the act of prostitution, the commercialization of sexual engagement. Tate argued that the prostitute is who opens herself up to a life of impurity and licentiousness, chooses many lovers, and is financially dependent on the life of prostitution. Wardlaw saw the prostitution as someone characterized by the voluntary and repeated surrendering of her virtues for sexual engagements, which shows that prostitutes were not always women who received money for sexual service, but also women who were sexually active in ways that were not permissible in the Victorian society. One commonality among their definitions and many others at the time was that they pointed out the prostitution as the evil, blaming their individual promiscuity and promiscuous tendencies. Their explanation on who prostitutes are in 1840s influenced heavily how prostitutes were understood in the social context. It is important to understand prostitution as a part of the ideological making of the nuclear family at the time that had the middle-class man as the breadwinner and the housewife as the angel in the house. This is crucial because prostitutes were a necessary component in making this Victorian ideology possible and sustainable. Men, wives, and prostitutes were interdependent in constructing the Victorian sexuality of men as well as women. Sexuality and eroticism were narrowly understood as sexual intercourse for reproduction. Sexual desires were no longer considered something to be explored, but something to be controlled, censoring sexual expressions or sexual transgressions. Sexuality in the Victorian age was a concept closely related to morality. This sounds more or less natural today, but sexuality wasn't always primarily associated with morality, monogamy, and heterosexuality, and was not always understood in terms of morality, respectability, and virtues. The enforcement of purity on wives was necessitated and justified by the industry of prostitution to keep the purity of wives while fulfilling intolerable sexual needs of men. Because male sexuality was considered something innate and intolerable, they had to be released while protecting wives from whom sexual intercourse was for reproductive purposes only. And thus the double standard on women and female sexuality was enforced, and the dichotomized understanding of women as either Madonna or the whore prevailed. Considering the spatiality of the society, the wives were in the private spheres of homes and prostitutes were in the public spheres of women on the streets or brothels, commercializing their bodies. From Victorian Englishmen's perspective, however, wives were used to uphold and maintain their social responsibilities and respectabilities in the public domain, while prostitutes were used for sex in privacy. Women were kept in two exclusive categories to make public and private lives of men possible, and in competition with each other, prostitutes became the symbols of being morally corrupt and worked as a correcting effect on other women. But the oppressive structure that kept them in each place was the same. One feminist of the time, Mary Hume Rothery, said wifehood is prostitution within the marriage bond. Elise Hopkins also said, since prostitutes were martyrs of purity, brothels should be put next to churches. Prostitutes as problematic women prevailed to crystallize the idea that they were the great social evil. Here are the ways they were perceived by the mainstream society. They were a materialistic seducer who has two implications, seducing young men and soldiers for money and seducing other respectable women with modern fashion and life of insobriety and obscenities. And therefore they were considered breakers of the middle-class homes, a threat no less. Male doctors and ministers created the pathologized image of the prostitutes, that they were the death spot to everything they touched, and lived shorter lives than average. Which was not necessarily true, but it was a powerful imagery that survived long even to today. Pitiful and morbid images were created, and prostitutes were portrayed as suicidal, and in some cases, if not dying of diseases already due to their miserable conditions, emphasizing the fallenness of a woman from youthful beauty, health, to death-like appearance and sexually transmitted diseases. Ralph Wardlaw, a minister, gave the reason for prostitutes that the strength of the sexual propensity and weakness of the moral principle as the primary reason. But prostitutes served more than one purpose, that is, the physical indulgence of male libido. Men used prostitutes to project their negative feelings and blame their character and behavior for misogynic ideas they had about women. Although the prostitutes were called the fallen women, many looked at prostitutes as already fell, because women in prostitution were considered inherently depraved and morally corrupt to begin with. They were blamed for the problems they had to do with sexuality and camouflaged the problem with state regulation of prostitution and safeguarded men who were active parts of the issue. However, such were the ideology of the time. In reality, the delineation between the two categories of women were not as distinct nor distinguishable. Moreover, prostitutes of the Victorian age cannot be fully comprehended as silent victims within the ideological framework who were diseased, drunk, and decadent. As many scholars admitted, because of stereotypical representation of and metaphorical use of the word prostitution and fallen women, it is difficult to reconstruct and understand the lives of women in prostitution at the time. Nonetheless, prostitutes must be understood from a broader perspective to examine how complex women's lives were in the 19th century. The categorization is often near impossible because the circumstances and class of women who go into prostitution differed and changed over time. Also, it is important to note that prostitution was not just about lower class women serving the higher class men. Many of the sexual trades were among the same class, and as I will show later, a large part of the male clients were soldiers of Army and Navy. The first is higher class of prostitutes, as you can see in the categorization, who are not exactly discreet about their profession. They were so fashionable that middle-class women tried to copy their fashion, which became a social problem. Kept mistresses can belong to this category as well, and one example would be Charles Dickens's mistress, Ellen Ternan. The working class women were the primary streetwalkers who depended on prostitution to make a living. Again, although it is hard to give a universal reason why, the researchers have found that many women were from poor families whose fathers were unskilled workingmen, and they had to depend on themselves to survive on a daily basis. Women admitted to rescue homes and locked hospitals, which were hospitals for venereal diseases, answered that they used to be servants, barmaids, waitresses, and mill workers. These professions were highly unstable and could not guarantee stable income or status in the society. This illustration shows how the Victorian society thought it was problematic that the prostitutes were indistinguishable from quote-unquote respectable ladies of a good family. And here are some statistics on the prostitution, such as the mid-century record of prostitutes in London, and police statistics of prostitutes in England, and number of women persecuted for prostitution in 1860. And this table shows that the age range of working women, as you can see, some are as young as under 20. And this shows that brothels were not the standard form of prostitution. Many women in this industry were self-hired and used brothels to transact their business rather than to reside in them. This evidence is significant because this shows that women in prostitution did not depend heavily on pimps, madams or brothels, or third parties to broker their trade, which is often the source of the problems such as financial exploitation by the broker, coercion into prostitution, and no liberty. England, compared to the other European countries, had less institutionalized prostitution system, which made prostitutes less visible in real life, and in official police documents, and indistinguishable from the working class or, in some cases, respectable ladies. Of course, there was a notorious exception that was the East End of London, where women did not earn as much money and were controlled largely by men who worked as pimps. Nevertheless, it is important that in general, the industry of prostitution in England were driven by women. Many in this occupation say that they were seduced by madams, who are pimps and owners of the brothels, and men into prostitution, but sometimes poverty and sexual violence led the way. But many reports from rescue homes and hospitals and prisons show that women, although reluctantly, chose the profession of prostitution for financial reasons and improved liberty. This opens a new interpretation of what prostitution actually looked like and how the popular image of miserable creatures can be misleading. And this is the second part of the presentation, the Contagious Disease Act. This talks about the much contested attempt at state-regulated prostitution and control of sexuality. Although ideological understanding of the Victorian society and prostitution lead to the assumption that the primary clientele would be the middle-class man, but the records existent today beg to differ. It was mostly enlisted men of Navy and Army, sailors, and working-class men who were not too poor that took up majority of the solicitors. This misleading understanding most probably derived from early responses made by religious writers on the issue in the 40s, who blamed partly the men of upper social class for seducing the lower class with property and social status. The Contagious Disease Acts reflect that the Victorian government's interest in state intervention to reform the poor class of the society, not just as a welfare, but as a means to control the poor class, which was seen both as degraded and devious. The venereal diseases was therefore seen as the challenging of the moral importance of the society by acting out. The state's active involvement in the underclass purported to correct their behavior. The acts therefore meant authorization of sex-selling business and lower-class civilians and providing disease-free entertainment to the men enlisted in the army to control their morality as well. Indeed, the rising number of military men infected by STDs was alarming. By 1864, 1 out of 3 sick cases was the venereal diseases among the enlisted men in the army. And 290 out of 1,000 of total troop strength was hospitalized for gonorrhea and syphilis. This was a serious concern of the army. The second reason can be understood from a broader perspective, that of sexual ideology. The CD Acts was the aftermath of the Victorian Society's treatment of sexuality as a public matter. The purpose of the acts included not only improvement of the medical conditions of the enlisted men, but also to correct their morality and regulate them back into decency. The different application of the acts on female and male also manifests the problematic codification of sexuality, where male sexuality and female sexuality were differently characterized, while reinforcing the dominance of male over female. And here is the timeline of the Contagious Disease Act. It is important to note that even though the prostitution was in existence long before 1864 and the public was very much aware of it, the acts that heed to sexually transmitted diseases was introduced only in 1864 and with many, many problems. The Contagious Disease Act, which were passed quietly and secretly, reflecting the secrecy and silence industry of prostitution in England, although it was not legal and regulated by the government so far, the prostitutes and the brothels' existence was vaguely noted in law. The first 2 acts were not elaborate in their reasons for implementation, but the initial purpose was to control the spread of venereal diseases among enlisted men and justify the sanitary supervision of prostitutes. 1864 acts did not legalize prostitution, but a woman identified as a diseased prostitute by a plainclothes member of the Metropolitan Police were forced to undergo an examination, and when found sick, she needs to voluntarily submit herself to the magistrate's order, so women were subjected to medical inspection. In 1866, the acts were changed to not allow prostitutes from escaping the police detection for examination. The acts were added the part system of periodic fortnightly inspection of all known prostitutes be made compulsory. As aforementioned, women were subjected to invasive medical inspection, which feminists argued against as instrumental rape. While women had to go through forced examination, military men were exempt from testings because it demoralized them and the antipathy among them was great. Meanwhile, women were given different treatment because women do not have self-respect and could not protest against the police force. Women in prostitution as well as middle-class women were enraged by the disparate treatment of women and men on the basis of sex. This called for multiple feminist movements to join the repeal campaign and lasted for 16 years, questioning not only the prostitution as state-sanctioned institute, but also touching upon other social problems. And the 3rd chapter covers the feminists against the prostitution. The CD Acts led to feminist movement that pointed out the paradox in separating the spheres of women. Instead, they argued structural changes that can change the status of women from inferior counterparts of men, but women with suffragette, education, safe jobs, and property. This is Josephine Butler, a famous feminist at the time who led the movement. She was the leader of Ladies' National Association and an activist for a repeal campaign who left the famous words, "The dependence of women upon men was taught and maintained by early training in the family, by unequal laws between the sexes as to marriage, property, and other matters." Ladies Against the CD Act argued that births were accidental, and so was class. Also, they argued that there is no inherent immorality, or morality for that matter. The prostitutes are the symptom of the broken society, not the cause. Respectable ladies are also under the same male oppression as prostitutes, not splitting women into two groups but uniting them under the same oppressive structure of patriarchy. Prostitution out of economic necessity, not because women are the source of evil and they do not deserve religious, social, moral lynching but need structural support and change, was the feminist argument at the time. Respectable ladies were exempt from prostitution because they were, by chance, born into circumstances that did not drive them into accommodating their bodies for money. Because many male writers on this issue of prostitution, including Gregg, Dr. William Acton, and early responders Tate, Wardlaw, and several others had strict attitude towards prostitutions and prostitutes, often in favor of heterosexual marriage and to get rid of the social evil. For instance, Gregg was remarkable in not equating prostitutes with diseases or promiscuity. He instead tried to look at the structural problems that led them to prostitution and did not give them any prospect of future. However, part of the reason why he argued against prostitution was because middle-class men might delay his marriage due to his indulgence with prostitutes. Also, male thinkers did not challenge the sexual ideology that the male libido was not controllable and had to have an outlet while female sexuality was dormant and controllable. Feminists saw the problem with such double standard of sexuality and identified it as the reason for inequality between the sexes. Therefore, they challenged the sexual ideology and argued that women should have education and better jobs as part of constitutive criticism of prostitution as a social problem. Next, they argued against the notion of innate class, morality, and decorum. Lastly, the ladies in the feminist movement, even though they were mostly from the middle class, identified with the women in prostitution. They purposefully claimed themselves as prostitutes to show solidarity, such as our fallen sisters, and we are all women. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope this was an opportunity for you to think about various issues surrounding the gendered ideology, medicalization of the bodies, and demonizing sexuality that started in the Victorian age, but that still live today. Here is my work cited, and thank you for listening to my presentation.